I'd like to welcome you to this public hearing of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is the third of 4 public hearings to consider comments concerning proposed rent adjustment for leases for apartments, lofts, hotels, and other housing units subject to the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974. These adjustments will affect renewal leases commencing between October 1st, 2023 through September 30th, 2024. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Doug Apple? Genesis Aquino? And if you could unmute, thank you.
Present.
Thank you. Thank you. Christina DeRose? Robert Ehrlich? Arpit Gupta?
Present.
Thank you. Alex Schwartz? Christina Smith?
Present.
Adon Soltran?
Present.
Nestor Davidson, I'm present. Please let the record show that we have a quorum. The next meeting of this board will be an in-person hearing on June 15th at St. Francis College, 179 Livingston Street in Brooklyn from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Anyone who wants to comment on the proposed rule of this public hearing must sign up to speak. People wishing to speak at the public hearing can pre-register in advance. You can pre-register online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, or you can sign up to speak by calling 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. Pre-registration ends at noon tomorrow, June 14th. For those who do not pre-register, registration is also available at the hearing from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. The public hearing will be live streamed. Interpretation will be provided to those testifiers speaking in Spanish, and I'll add that we have other interpretation available upon request. Our final vote will take place on Wednesday, June 21st, starting at 7 p.m. at Hunter College Assembly Hall, which is on 69th Street between Park and Lexington Avenues in Manhattan, with doors opening at 6 p.m. Please note the change in venue from the Great Hall at Cooper Union. The public may attend and observe the meeting in person or may watch the vote live, streaming it on the RGB's YouTube channel. To find out how, visit the RGB website, nyc.gov/RGB, or call the RGB again at 212-669-7480 between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. We are also taking comments on our proposed guidelines outside of our public hearings. If you are unable to attend our hearings, you can submit written, audio, or video comments prior to the hearings for the board members' review through June 15th. Instructions to submit these comments are available on the board's website at nyc.gov/RGB, by email at ask@rgb.nyc.gov, or by calling the RGB, again at 212-669-7480. I'd like to thank you all for attending this public hearing. The board is looking forward to hearing from many of you regarding the proposed rent adjustments. Before we proceed to testimony, I would like to go over the rules and procedures for those who are testifying before the board. This year, the board has in-person hearings in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. Therefore, we are providing priority at this virtual hearing to those participants who either live in or own a building in Manhattan. Once we have heard from our Manhattan group of registered speakers, we'll take testimony from registered tenants and owners who live and own properties outside of Manhattan. We will alternate between tenants, owners, and public officials with a speaking limit of 2 minutes per person. When it is your turn to speak, a staff member will promote you from an attendee to a panelist, and you will have the ability to speak and display your video if you choose. Please wait for your name to be announced before you commence your testimony. It is essential that your Zoom name matches that with which you registered. If you are attending the Zoom hearing with a name or phone number that differs from the name or phone number you registered with, we will not be able to identify you and you may lose your place in the queue. If you were not asked to enter your name in Zoom when you signed into this hearing, your Zoom name will be that of the Zoom account you are signed into. If this name differs from the one you registered with, we suggest you log out of Zoom and re-enter the Zoom hearing, at which time you will be prompted to enter your name. If you are not an attendee of the hearing at the time your name is called, you may lose your place in the queue. A 2-minute timer will begin and will be displayed periodically during your testimony. At the conclusion of your testimony, you will become an attendee again without speaking privileges and we'll move on to our next speaker. There are Spanish interpreters here today. To listen to testimony in Spanish, please use the interpretation button in Zoom to choose the appropriate channel. For English speakers, select the English channel to hear English speakers as well as Spanish speakers interpreted into English. If you do not choose an interpretation channel, you will hear all testimony in the native language of the speaker. If you are using the Zoom app on a smartphone, you may find the interpretation button by pressing the More button. We have many registered speakers and the board wants to hear from as many speakers as possible in the limited time we have for this hearing. We understand that it may be difficult to say everything you want us to hear in just 2 minutes, but please understand that it is our responsibility to make sure that everyone who has taken the time to join us here this evening and testify will have a fair opportunity to be heard. We thank you for your cooperation. And we can now begin. Brian?
Me gustaría darles la bienvenida a esta audiencia pública de la Junta de Normas sobre Alquileres de la Ciudad de Nueva York. Esta es la tercera de 4 audiencias públicas para tomar en cuenta los comentarios relacionados a los ajustes de alquiler propuestos para los contratos de alquiler de apartamentos, lofts o altillos, hoteles y otras unidades de vivienda sujetas a la Ley de Estabilización de Alquileres de 1969 y la Ley de Protección de Inquilinos de Emergencia de 1974. Estos ajustes afectarán a los alquileres de renovación que empiecen entre el 1 de octubre de 2023 y el 30 de septiembre de 2024. Ahora pasaré lista. Por favor, respondan si están presentes. Doug Apple, presente. Genesis Aquino, presente. Christina DeRose, presente. Robert Ehrlich, ausente. Arpit Gupta, presente. Alex Schwartz, ausente. Christina Smith, presente. Adam Soltran, presente. Y Nestor Davidson, presente. Que conste en acta que contamos con un quórum. La próxima reunión de esta junta será una audiencia pública presencial que se celebrará el 15 de junio en el St. Francis College, en el 179 de la calle Livingston en Brooklyn, de 5 a 8 de la noche. Cualquier persona que desee hacer comentarios sobre la norma propuesta en esta audiencia pública debe inscribirse para declarar. Las personas que deseen declarar en la audiencia pública pueden inscribirse con antelación. Puede inscribirse en línea a través de nuestro sitio web nyc.gov, /RGB, o puede inscribirse para declarar llamando al 212-669-7480 de 9 a 5 de la tarde, de lunes a viernes. La inscripción con antelación terminará el 14 de junio al mediodía. Quienes no se hayan inscrito también podrán hacerlo en la audiencia de 5 a 8 de la noche. La audiencia pública se transmitirá en directo. Se proporcionará interpretación a los declarantes que hablen en español. La votación final tendrá lugar el miércoles 21 de junio a partir de las 7 de la noche en el Hunter College Assembly Hall, situado en la calle 69 entre las avenidas Park y Lexington de Manhattan. Se abrirán las puertas a las 6 de la tarde. Por favor, tengan en cuenta el cambio de lugar de la reunión de The Great Hall en Cooper Union. El público podrá asistir y observar la reunión en persona o ver la votación en directo, que se transmitirá en el canal de YouTube de la RGB. Para saber cómo hacer esto, visite el sitio web de la RGB, nyc.gov/RGB, o llame a la RGB al 212-669-7480 entre las 9 de la mañana y las 5 de la tarde. También podemos recibir comentarios sobre las normas propuestas fuera de nuestro horario de audiencias públicas. Si no puede acudir a nuestras audiencias, puede presentar comentarios por escrito, por audio o por video antes de las audiencias, para que los miembros de la Junta los examinen hasta el 15 de junio. Las instrucciones para presentar estos comentarios estarán disponibles en el sitio web de la Junta en nyc.gov/RGB, por correo electrónico a ask@rgb.nyc.gov, o al llamar a la RGB al 212-669-7480. Me gustaría darles las gracias a todos por asistir a esta audiencia pública. La Junta desea escuchar a muchos de ustedes en relación con las normas de ajuste de alquiler propuestas, pero antes de proceder con sus testimonios, me gustaría repasar las normas y procedimientos para aquellos que declararán ante la Junta. Este año la Junta celebrará audiencias presenciales en el Bronx, Brooklyn y Queens Por lo tanto, estamos dando prioridad en esta audiencia virtual a los participantes que vivan o sean propietarios de un edificio en Manhattan. Una vez que hayamos escuchado al grupo de hablantes inscritos de Manhattan, tomaremos testimonio de los inquilinos y propietarios inscritos que vivan y poseen propiedades fuera de Manhattan. Alternaremos entre inquilinos, propietarios y funcionarios públicos, con un límite de intervención de 2 minutos por persona. Cuando le toque hablar, un miembro del personal lo cambiará o la cambiará de asistente a panelista y usted podrá hablar y activar su cámara si así lo desea. Por favor, espere que se anuncie su nombre antes de darle inicio a su testimonio. Es esencial que su nombre de Zoom coincida con aquel con el que usted se inscribió. Si usted asiste a la audiencia de Zoom con un nombre o número de teléfono que difiera del nombre o número de teléfono con el que se inscribió, no podremos identificarle y podría perder su puesto en la fila. Si no se le pidió que colocara su nombre en Zoom cuando se inscribió para esta audiencia, su nombre en Zoom será el de la cuenta de Zoom con la que usted inició esta sesión. Si este nombre difiere del que utilizó al inscribirse, le sugerimos que salga de Zoom y vuelva a entrar en esta audiencia de Zoom, momento en el que se le pedirá que inserte su nombre. Si no asiste a la audiencia en el momento en que se diga su nombre, también perderá su puesto en la fila. Se iniciará un temporizador de 2 minutos que se mostrará periódicamente durante su testimonio. Una vez concluido su testimonio, volverá a ser asistente sin derecho a hablar y pasaremos al siguiente hablante. Contamos con intérpretes de español esta tarde y para escuchar el testimonio en español, por favor, utilice el botón de interpretación en Zoom para elegir el canal adecuado. Para los hablantes de inglés, elijan el canal en inglés para escuchar a los hablantes en inglés, así como a los hablantes de español de cuyo testimonio se interpretará al inglés. Si no elige un canal de interpretación, escuchará todos los testimonios en la lengua materna del hablante. Si utiliza la aplicación Zoom en un teléfono inteligente, podrá encontrar el botón de interpretación pulsando el botón More, M-O-R-E en mayúsculas, lo que significa más o más opciones. Tenemos muchos hablantes inscritos y la Junta desea escuchar al mayor número posible de ellos en el tiempo limitado de que disponemos para esta audiencia. Y entendemos que puede ser difícil decir todo lo que usted quiera que oigamos en solo 2 minutos, pero por favor entienda que es nuestro deber asegurarnos de que todos los que se hayan tomado el tiempo en acudir y testificar tengan la oportunidad justa de que se les escuche. Le agradecemos su colaboración. Gracias.
Thank you so much. And before we begin, I just want to note that we have been joined by Alex Schwartz and that Rob Ehrlich is here and was here, but was having an audio issue and I think is resolved now. I think we can begin, Brian. Sorry, let's translate that and then let's begin.
I think the interpretation channel is available now.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, allow me to recognize New York State Senator Robert Jackson.
So good afternoon to Chair and members of the Rent Guidelines Board. I'm State Senator Robert Jackson, representing the 31st Senatorial District, comprising of Northern Manhattan, which includes Washington Heights, Inwood, and Marble Hill, and parts of the Northwest Bronx, approximately 325,000 constituents. The lack of affordable housing is the top priority that I hear in my district. Knowing that of the New York State Senators, I have 88% are renters, and it's the 3rd highest in the New York State Senate. From aging to single parents, large households, and recent graduates, it is evident most people are struggling, I've said it twice, to get by with the rising cost of living in New York City. And this month, the RGB has a crucial opportunity to stand up and say no to further destabilizing households amidst this uncertain economic climate, and yes to upending unaffordability crisis, protecting tenants from oppressive rent and stopping a massive wave of evictions. New York was already in a housing crisis pre-pandemic, and we must act now to mitigate the compounding effects of the systemic oppression that exacerbates the housing affordability crisis. I strongly urge the RGB to roll back the rents. And if you're saying, are you crazy? No, I'm not crazy. Or at a minimum, freeze the rent so ensure that rent stabilized tenants can stay in their homes. Every eviction is a policy failure because housing is a human right. And to consider increases of 5 to 7% for a 2-year lease when New Yorkers are still rebuilding their lives instead of a rent freeze, it is intentionally choosing to disrupt the livelihoods and perpetuate a cycle of instability and homelessness that affects the most vulnerable members of our community. I urge you to stand up, don't be afraid, and vote no to detrimental rent hikes. Thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Let me next recognize Senator Sepulveda.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me a few minutes to make my statement. I'm State Senator Luis Sepulveda from the 32nd District in the Bronx, and I have the honor and distinction of having the highest total of constituents that reside in apartments. 93% of my constituents are tenants, and that is the highest in the entire city, in the entire state. So, you know, when the Rent Guideline Board made the decision to increase rent for millions of rent-stabilized tenants, it was a matter of concern for me and all hardworking individuals in New York City, because this is potentially the highest increase the board has had in a decade, following what happened last year with the 3.2 to 5% 1-year to lease increases. Now, you know, I should shed some light on the life impact that these rent increases have. Stories of my seniors who recently sought assistance in my office. We had seniors who are disabled, resides in rent-stabilized apartments. They used to live there with their families and their late spouse. But over time, the family members moved on to their lives, and unfortunately, the spouse passed away. To cover their rent and expenses, these seniors rely on programs like DREAT. Sometimes, you know, their own Social Security income, food stamps aren't enough. So the loss of a spouse's Social Security income makes a terrible impact when you have these kinds of rent hikes on these very same individuals. You know, their monthly rent has reached such proportions that they fear falling behind in their apartments and getting evicted. For 2 decades, the seniors person has called the apartment home, and it's very distressing to them to now live under the fear that they may lose what they worked for. So I stand here urging the Rent Guideline Boards to reconsider their decision, to please take into consideration the 93% of the people that I represent who may have terrible impacts with these increases. Thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. Let me next recognize Assemblymember Rosenthal.
Hi, thank you. I'm Assemblymember Linda B. Rosenthal. I'm chair of the Assembly Committee on Housing, and I represent the Upper West Side and parts of Hell's Kitchen in the 67th Assembly District. I'd like to thank the RGB for the opportunity to comment on the board's proposal to increase rents by 2 to 5% on 1-year leases and 4 to 7% on 2-year leases for rent-stabilized tenants. Thousands of my constituents and New Yorkers throughout the city are living on the precipice of eviction. A little more than 3 years ago, COVID upended the world, and my office heard from people desperately searching for financial assistance to help pay the rent, put food on the table, cover medical expenses, and other requirements of daily living. Now, as the RGB's data clearly demonstrates, many tenants are still frantically applying for one-shot deals, food stamps, medical assistance to stay financially afloat in this ever increasingly expensive city. The RGB's decision to recommend substantial rent increases for millions of rent-regulated tenants during an affordability and homelessness crisis is not acceptable. Most New York City tenants are rent-burdened. Almost 40% of rent-stabilized tenants spend most of their income on rent, and 35% of rent-stabilized tenants pay more than 30% of their income on rent. With over 92,000 New Yorkers sleeping on the streets or in the shelter, another rent increase will make it only more difficult for people to stay housed. As of April 2023, the median rent for a 1-bedroom in Manhattan and Brooklyn was $4,200 and $3,350 respectively. New Yorkers are financially hanging on by a thread. Large building owners, especially real estate investment trusts, are living a far different financial reality than their rent-regulated tenants. The data used by RGB from 2021 should not be used for 2023 because high-income residents have returned to the city. Market rate tenants are meeting soaring rents. ERAP has paid landlords billions of dollars in arrears, and some landlords would rather take a tax write-off than rent vacant units. We cannot contribute to the housing emergency and crisis by raising rents, cannot allow more families to enter shelter. I urge the RGB to keep people in their homes by reversing its decision to raise the rents on the city's most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Council Member Carlina Rivera.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony regarding proposed lease adjustments for rent stabilized apartments in New York City. As council member for Council District 2, I represent neighborhoods including the East Village, Lower East Side, Flatiron, Gramercy, Rose Hill, Kips Bay, and Murray Hill. And with my roots in a community that has had to organize to keep people in their homes, I have seen how affordable housing has become increasingly scarce and prohibitively expensive for working families. A 2023 report from the Fund for the City of New York and United Way indicates that 50% of New York households are struggling to cover their basic needs, and that almost 80% of households below the true cost of living are considered housing cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. The most recent New York City Community Health Survey reports that 49% of all households on the Lower East Side are rent burdened. The New York Housing Conference estimates that 31% of New York renters are in arrears, with each household in arrears owing more than $9,500 in unpaid rent, for a total of more than $145 million. The Rent Guidelines Board has the responsibility to analyze housing market conditions in the determination of lease adjustments. And at a time when the city's Black population declined by 200,000 people, it would be misguided to increase prices on rent stabilized apartments. We really should try to maintain as much diversity as possible, and that includes in the housing stock. It would be more appropriate to roll back or freeze rents to ensure working class and legacy residents can afford to live here. And at a time of uncertainty, the decisions made by the Rent Guidelines Board impacts the collective identity of our city. I understand that property owners also face difficulties recovering from the pandemic. Inflation and other factors have worsened that hardship, but this cannot be resolved by raising prices on New Yorkers that simply can't afford higher rent. The New York City and state government must step up and identify gaps in services and outreach and ensure that landlords have the resources needed to operate safe and healthy buildings. The Rent Guidelines Board has a significant role to play in setting housing policy for the city. I urge the board to consider the significant burden on renters and institute a rent rollback, or at the very least, freeze rents at current levels. Thank you so much for the time to testify, and I look forward to working with you all in the future.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, well, let me recognize John Derrico.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is John Derrico. I live in a rent-stabilized apartment with my family in Peter Cooper Village. I'm a director of the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village Tenants Association and a member of Community Board 6. I'm also a class action lawyer by trade, and I have spent hundreds of hours advocating for housing rights on a pro bono basis for the past couple of years. Tonight, you'll hear many impassioned pleas for help from tenants and tenant advocates. These pleas are all well-reasoned and meaningful, but I will only speak to you in plain economic terms and policy terms. Nestor Davidson, from our time together at Fordham Law, I know and hope you will appreciate this. Nearly 40% of rent-stabilized households spend more than 50% of their income on rent. Inflation-adjusted wages are down by over 2%. In short, people are being paid less, but paying more for rent. However, over 60,000 rent stabilized units are kept off the market, intentionally so, and landlords are able to manipulate higher priced rents, a phenomenon called warehousing. In reality, this is nothing but fabricated price scarcity. And moreover, this is fabricated price scarcity during a time of great struggle for the everyday working person. Under these circumstances, the only economically reasonable solution is a rent rollback, or at a minimum, a rent freeze. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Thank you so much. Now let me recognize Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to the board members for this opportunity to speak. I'm going to be submitting testimony in written form that I prepared jointly with my colleague, Councilmember Keith Powers, and I'll just speak about some of the main points of our testimony here now in the time I have allotted. I understand that as a board, you have the enormous responsibility of weighing both the costs faced by owners as well as the burdens faced by tenants. But I want to say very clearly that I believe this is not the time for a rent increase. That we, Councilmember Powers as well, believe that there should not be an increase in rents now for the simple reason that tenants are facing enormous pain. They're facing rising prices of all manner of consumer goods, from food to clothing to transportation, at a time when many are seeing their wages stagnate. In fact, many live on fixed incomes amidst these rising prices. And so the increase in rents is a serious burden. In fact, as the previous speaker mentioned, the estimate is that 39.5% of rent stabilized households are now paying more than half of their income to rent. This is widely accepted as being a very serious burden on families that forces them to make difficult choices about paying for essential needs. We cannot, in this environment, add extra burden to so many families, because if they can't afford their apartments and lose their home and are forced to rent on the private market, they will face what in Manhattan is now an average rent of over $5,200. Again, that is the average rent in Manhattan for a market rate apartment. And if that's what tenants are forced into, many will wind up homeless. We cannot let that happen. We need to help tenants remain in the homes that they can currently afford by not increasing rent at this time. Thank you so much for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Let me recognize now Andrew Hoffman.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. We need reasonable increases because owner expenses continue to go up. The largest expenses owners pay right now are to the city of New York. Our real estate taxes, our water charges, and other city payments that we make in running our buildings equal over 40% of our building expenses. Property taxes have went up over 75% in the last decade for older rent-stabilized buildings outside the core of Manhattan. The city has increased property taxes on these buildings dramatically this year. Many buildings in the Bronx saw increases of over 10%. Over the years, we've seen huge increases in water and sewer and all the other fees that we have to pay in New York City. The biggest single expense in the past decade that has went up is our insurance. It has more than doubled. And many buildings I manage cannot even get the proper amount of excess liability I want, and that's at any price. Our labor costs go up every year. And we have to follow strict contract rules with Local 32BJ, and there's no room for any cost savings here. And our fuel goes up every year, even though we've taken extensive advantage of energy efficiency measures. I can't control my fuel costs, and I cannot control the severity of the winters. And every year, it seems that the RGB only talks about core Manhattan. While the pandemic certainly hit all buildings hard, core Manhattan has been better positioned to recover over time. In the other 70% of rent-stabilized housing stock, they have no hope at things getting better unless the Rent Guidelines Board adjusts rents to keep up with these costs. And now with the higher interest rates, Many small owners can no longer afford loans to help with capital improvements, and they'll be forced to pay for these expenses through slim operating margins. We need your help.
Thank you.
Our expenses go up every year. We have no recourse to pay our bills. Please give us our reasonable increases so we can keep up with our increasing expenses. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Let me next recognize Susan Steinberg.
Thank you. I'm Susan Steinberg, president of the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village Tenants Association, and I'm speaking for 11,242 rent regulated units. But I'm going to start with me. I moved into Stuyvesant Town in January of 1980 to my present one bedroom at a starting rent of $325 a month. From that time until this, nothing has changed. Same layout, same number of rooms, same square footage, same 1947 bathroom and kitchen. The only thing that has changed is the rent goes up and up and up. But now an equivalent apartment, the same one bedroom that I have, goes for $4,900. And what could possibly merit a 15-fold increase since 1980, other than the fact that landlords feel that they need to keep their profits up, which I understand are now down to a devastating 33.6%. But who makes that? Do you know what the titans of industry make? For example, 2022 profits for Google, 10%, for Amazon, 2%, for Tesla, 15.7%. And the rents here are now so high that I get into arguments with tenants who don't believe they're rent regulated. Oh, I'm market rate. No, you're rent regulated. Well, I'm market rate because of the rent I pay. No, you're rent regulated, pay market rent. And people here are really concerned. To live here, they double up, they triple up, they quadruple up. Many are rent burdened. They're battling inflation and stagnant incomes. So the Tenants Association decided to find out exactly what the impact of the proposed rent increases would be. And at a very recent community event, we circulated a petition asking people if they were really going to be threatened with the proposed rent increases to sign. And under 4 hours, we had 500 names. We need a rollback. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Let me next recognize Ilan Rabinovich.
La próxima persona será Alan Rabinovich.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak and testify here. I'm a small landlord by every definition of the term. I own one 4-unit building here on the Upper West Side. The vast majority of my tenants are rent stabilized units. You know, at this point, as some of the other folks have testified, I understand that tenants are rent burdened, but us as landlords are also expense burdened, primarily by expenses controlled by the city. The combined legal rents that I'm allowed to collect don't even cover my property tax, let alone maintenance of the property or improvements. To offer a few examples, my property tax increased by 7.2% in 2022 and increased by another 8% in 2023. My insurance costs went up by 50% from 2022 to 2023. The utility costs that I pay to provide electricity for the common areas as well as heat for my tenants' apartments went up by 35%. Just mundane things like fire sprinkler inspections that I have to pay for every month to stay legal with my building went up by 18% in 2023. And I expect utilities to keep going up this year as well. It's just I can only forecast out based on where we are so far. At the same time, I was allowed to raise my tenants' rent by, I think it was 3.2% last year. So not even keeping up with the additional cost the city is putting on me. I would urge the RGB to raise rents by the originally recommended 16%. That won't even allow me to break even, but it'll at least start to make a dent. And for those elected officials testifying here about the hard costs that tenants are facing and asking for us to reduce rent, well, the best way that you can do that is to change your policies. You're the ones voting for increased property taxes. You're the ones voting for allowing our utility companies to increase the cost that they charge us. There's all kinds of things that you could be doing policy-wise to assist the tenants here, as well as to assist landlords in maintaining our costs at reasonable levels. I don't make money on my building. I lose money every month and every year. And what the RGB can do here is get me to a point where I can at least afford to start to continue to maintain my building and offer roofs to tenants that need it. I will note that none of my tenants are rent burdened. They all earn hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and still pay less than $1,000 a month in rent for large apartments. Thank you. And again, I urge you to do the right thing here and support our housing stock.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Kim Mascaratolo.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Mascaratolo. I am a rent stabilized tenant here in Yorkville on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. For years, my husband and I lived in market rate housing, and every year we fretted as we waited for notice from our management company about our lease renewal and the inevitable rent increase that would come with it. And while our rent luckily did not increase during the pandemic, last year we faced a sudden increase of 10%. So fortunately, at about that same time, after years of sitting on affordable housing waiting lists, we were finally selected for a rent stabilized apartment on 86th Street in York Avenue. And we felt so lucky because we'd finally have some stability. You know, we'd know from year to year how much our rent would go up and we'd be protected from exorbitant rent hikes. It was like a weight had been lifted off of our shoulders. So imagine our dismay upon seeing the numbers that were put out by this board recently, increases as high as 7% for 2-year leases. For us, that could mean an extra $225 a month. My husband has his own business. I work at a nonprofit. I can assure you I will not be receiving a 7% raise next year. We all understand inflation. We know prices have gone up, but tenants living in the city just trying to get by cannot be expected to bear the brunt of those increases. The rent hikes proposed today will force some people to have to move. And for those who can't afford to move, because remember, moving is actually really expensive, they'll fall behind on their rent, they'll try to cut corners by buying less food or medicine, and they'll ultimately be evicted, and they'll become yet another family out on the streets. So you have the opportunity to keep that from happening by freezing rents and allowing people the peace and security that comes with knowing that they can afford to stay in your home. So I just urge all of you to think about the ramifications of the decisions that you will be making. And I hope that you will make the right decision, freeze rents, and allow tenants like myself and hundreds of thousands of others to remain in their homes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Ryan, if you could promote our next speaker, please.
I'm working on it. Hold on 1 second, please.
Thank you.
If I could take this minute to just make a quick announcement. If you pre-registered, you were told that your Zoom name has to match the name that you registered with. There are some people here as attendees with just a first name, just an acronym. Unless you have the same name that we see when you registered, you're going to have to log out of Zoom, log back in, and enter your name. Because if it's just your first name, we do not know that you're the person who registered. So please consider logging out, coming back in. Zoom will ask you for your name. You were emailed the name that you used to register. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Seth Glasser, let me recognize you now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Seth Glasser, a New York City multifamily commercial real estate broker and co-host of the New York City Multifamily Podcast. I am not speaking to you as an owner, rent stabilized tenant, or even a New York City resident. Think of me as a concerned citizen. I'd like to highlight a hard truth. Costs are rising in every area of life, including rents. Consider rent stabilized tenants who, despite feeling the financial pinch, enjoy protections that 2/3 of city residents don't. As neighborhoods mature, these tenants reap benefits from safer surroundings and robust local economies. But let's be clear, rent regulation, while protecting some, drives up costs for everyone else, especially average earners in market rate apartments. These are the truly rent burdened, often priced out of the city due to the supply constraints that stabilization creates. Maintaining and upgrading America's oldest housing stock is expensive. The private sector is ready, willing, and able to shoulder these costs, benefiting local employment and improving housing stock. But this requires financial balance, which rental increases promote. If landlords abandon these buildings, who will fund our housing? We've seen the state of NYCHA housing: lead, dirty water, mold, pests, and lingering repairs. Surely we don't want more of that. Bad landlords should be penalized, just like any bad actor in any profession. However, most landlords are regular, well-intentioned people deeply involved in the human elements of property management and get no joy from enforcing evictions. They too have families to go home to. They're not villains. Consider rent stabilization's downside. It bars you from home ownership, mobility, and building equity. The unintended consequence of HSTPA was that it wiped out tenant equity. No more buyouts. The simple math goes like this. 1 million apartments averaging $100,000 per buyout is $100 billion of equity for the city's most vulnerable inhabitants. $100 billion gone. We should vote for rental increases, not because it helps landlords, but because it can vastly improve living conditions for countless New Yorkers. Rejecting intuition, let's support tenants by enabling their landlords to maintain and enhance their homes for future generations by voting for reasonable RGB increases. We can all win at a compassionate capitalist system. Let's grow the pie, not divide it up. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me next recognize Sarah McDaniel Dyer.
Hello, I'm a rent stabilized tenant and the front door of my building has been broken for 3 months now, and my landlord will absolutely come up here and tell you he can't afford to fix it unless you let him raise the rent. He'll tell you must raise our rent because the property tax is too high for him to fulfill his legal obligation to ensure the safety of his tenants. What he won't tell you is that two of the 20 units in our building covers that tax bill. And our front door is still broken. I still have to call 311 every year to get the heat and hot water turned on. Why should I reward this behavior with more money? It's frustrating and it's heartbreaking to watch people get pushed out of my community because someone told their shareholders my neighborhood in Inwood was an investment opportunity. If you want a city that is safe and vibrant, you need stable and affordable housing for everyone. The minimum wage in New York hasn't gone up since 2019, but landlords need a raise. Can we stop acting like the main driver of homelessness in our city isn't greed? We lost congressional seats, not because people don't want to live here, but because they literally can't afford it. I'm sick of having to come here every year and act like we don't all know these facts. We lost political power in our nation because of landlord greeds. We care more about landlord profits than the actual people who run this city. That's the price of landlord greed. And if you're not good with that reality, then you'll roll the rents back. Thank you for your time.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm working on the next one.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Andrew. Thank you. Let me recognize Jacqueline Wong.
Good evening, members of the board. My name is Jacqueline Wong, and my husband David and I are landlords with a rent stabilized building in Chinatown. Our property was passed down to us from David's father, who immigrated to the United States. Soon after his arrival to the U.S., he enlisted in the Army during World War I, serving as a mechanic for the Flying Tigers. After the war, due to his immigration status, he was unable to get a job in his field and settled for a job in the restaurant business. Little by little, he saved money until he was able to purchase a building and became a landlord. Many of our tenants are extended family members of those who signed leases with us, with my father-in-law. We have known our tenants for 25 years. We work diligently to provide them safe and comfortable housing. However, in recent years, we have witnessed a significant increase in operating expenses due to rising property taxes, as well as increases in insurance premiums and maintenance costs. These cost escalations are impacting our ability to continue to provide the type of services that our tenants have come to rely on. Often, we are unable to make necessary improvements. The need for repairs to aging building equipment, such as boilers, could be financially devastating to an owner. Our property is a 20-unit building. The average unit monthly rent is $1,000 per month. We have 8 tenants who pay well below that average, 4 who pay less than $750 per month, with 1 paying less than $300 per month. Last year, after years of expensive repairs to the boiler system, we decided to replace it. The cost of the new boiler was $95,000. Labor to install the new boiler was $30,000. As you can see, the numbers don't work. It's crucial for the board to strike a balance that considers the needs of both tenants and landlords. Consider options in assisting tenants without hurting the landlords. We respectfully ask for an appropriate increase to allow us to properly maintain our buildings and provide the services that our tenants have grown to rely on. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Emily Janetta.
Thank you for having me. I'm calling from my office in the Lower East Side, where I work as a clinical social worker. Many of the young people I see as clients are living in poverty, and some of them are navigating homelessness. When they tell me they want to go to college so that they can get a job like mine, I don't know how to say that they will still be struggling, because even with a master's degree and a professional license, I can barely afford my rent-stabilized studio in a 6th-floor walk-up in Yorkville. Half the money I take home goes to rent and utilities, which in social services we refer to as being rent burdened. Much of the rest of my income goes toward paying down the debt I acquired from getting sick with COVID. Despite being young and fully vaccinated and having no pre-existing conditions, COVID left me bedbound for most of the last year. I lost my previous job doing crisis work with unhoused people and had to crowdfund to stay housed myself. And like many people in that position, it wasn't my first time narrowly avoiding a shelter. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence who has had to couch surf to stay safe, who has moved from sublet to sublet and been illegally evicted in gentrifying neighborhoods. When I graduated with my MSW in 2021 and found a rent-stabilized apartment, I thought that I would finally have stability, and I don't. Obviously, our housing issues are caused by a whole constellation of policy failures, but the very least that the city can do is ensure that rent-stabilized apartments remain barely within reach of essential workers so that we can stay here and continue to work. Every time you approve a rent increase, you not only make the homelessness problem worse, but you push out the people who are working to resolve it. If my landlord truly cannot afford to replace the boiler in my building that goes out for a whole day every month, or the refrigerator that has died 3 times, or the dumpsters without lids that are crawling with rats, an extra $120 per month from me is not going to be enough for him to fix it, and that hints at a problem much larger than this board can address. But an extra $120 a month from me will push me out of this city along with so many others, and that's something you can stop by freezing the rents or issuing a rollback. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Leon Goldenberg.
Good evening. The job of the RGB is to review the increased costs in the operations of buildings. This should be the sole function of the RGB. Whether a tenant can or cannot afford an increase is really not the job of the RGB. That should be borne by the public as a whole. When people can't afford to buy milk or eggs, the government gives out food stamps. They don't tell grocers to lower their prices. I have recommended 4 years ad nauseum to many members of the legislatures, both city and state, that discrete program that was enacted for seniors should be introduced on a much larger scale for low-income people. The city and the state should be picking up the increases in rent that the landlord is duly entitled to. Over the past 10 years, landlords have received a total of about 9% in increase. That's it. My taxes alone have increased more than 9% of my total rent roll, not over prior year's taxes. My taxes have increased from as little as 25 to 50%, in some places close to 100% on individual buildings over the past 9 years. Next month, my taxes are going up 4.1% on average in all my buildings, with my income down 8%. My insurance have increased more than 9% again. Of my rent roll, insurance has almost tripled in the last 8-9 years. I am not even talking about the increase in minimum wage, fuel, water. Using basic math, how do you expect us to maintain our buildings? There is no increase outside of what you give us. There are no increases on vacants. Landlords are sitting on 35,000 apartments that require major capital improvements with a minimal increase. The 15,000 allotted on the new IAI program is not sufficient to do the renovation, nor does it make any financial sense. I would be happy to show you any of these apartments that I am holding and see if we are exaggerating to the conditions and the renovations of some of these apartments. Years ago, RGB gave additional increase on extremely low rents. Yes, I have tenants who pay as little as $403. So even a 4.5% increase is only $18. In the buildings we manage, we have 55 apartments that cost $700. Give us an increase based on our actual costs and have the city and state subsidize the tenants. I'm happy
Thank
to
you.
answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciated. Let me next recognize Ren Ping Chen.
Hi, Julie. 你这个讲了。
Yeah.
你好，我的名字叫陈仁平，我是唐人街住客协会的会员，我是租金稳定的住客，住在马哈顿唐人街32年了。
Hello, my name is Renping Chen. I am a member of CAV's Chinatown Tenants Union. I am a rent stabilized tenant. I've lived in Manhattan's Chinatown for 32 years now.
我今天来要求要减租，我现在租金1552块3毛6，我的退休金是794块。
I don't hear him.
这个
Excuse me, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Yes? Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So he just said, I'm here to demand a rent rollback. My rent is currently $1,552.36. My retirement is only $794. This is not enough to pay my rent.
这个租金不够付还租，我现在65岁了，也不要做装修的工作了，但是我为了付租金，我还在外面爬探，为了生活。
I'm 65 years old now and cannot continue to work in the construction industry. But because I need to pay my rent, I'm currently working part-time to be able to afford to live.
我现在我的装修一辈子都做2次的手术的。我的65岁应该可以退休了。我现在为了还租，还在外面爬探和工作。
I did construction work my whole life. It took a toll and I've had to have back surgery twice. I'm 65 and I deserve to retire. But now because I need to pay my rent, I have to continue working.
唐人街很多住客都给房东杀了和驱赶，如果不付房租，就把他驱赶走，驱赶就变成流浪汉。
Chinatown has many tenants who experience harassment and eviction. If we don't pay the rent, we will be evicted. If we are evicted, we become homeless.
Not right. 你们加租就是加老人退休金的 还租退休金的租金。
When you
你们想让我逼到街上做流浪汉吗？我们应该要怎么办？
When you raise the rent, you are raising the rent on elderly retirees like me. Do you want us to be on the streets and homeless? What do you want us to do?
你们要考虑一下我们退休的住客。我要求租金赔偿委员会市长一定要减租。
The Rent Guidelines Board needs to consider retired tenants like me. We are demanding a rent rollback.
好，谢谢。
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Harvey Epstein.
Thank you for letting me join. I really want to appreciate the work for the members of the Rent Guidelines Board. As some of you may know, I sat on the Rent Guidelines Board for 5 years as one of the tenant representatives. First under Mayor Bloomberg and then Mayor de Blasio. And so this is something that I'm very familiar with and something that I have worked on in my professional life. And along with 25 of my colleagues in the state assembly, we really took a position looking at all the data, knowing what we've seen in Albany, knowing what the tenants and the landlords have experienced in the last year, looking at the price index of operating costs, looking at tenant and affordability. And we really believe that we need a rent freeze this year. And I understand there are concerns from the landlord side and there are concerns the tenant side. But the reality is every 1% rent increase will result in additional evictions. And we've seen that. And we're in a city with 90,000 homeless people, 45,000 new New Yorkers. We're busting at the seams on all our shelter system because we put 40,000 people, new New Yorkers who are migrants into our system. We've used every facility in my district, an abandoned school, and abandoned police academy. We're using a pool. I mean, every facility because we have a crisis of that exists here in New York. And we as people who are public officials appointed to the Rent Guidelines Board, or people like me as a state assembly member, have to look at the entire picture and know the hardship that New Yorkers are facing. But the reality is now is not the time for a rent increase. Now is not the time to have that experience. This is not something new. This is something that we see every day in our city. We have a responsibility to deal with the crisis of affordability. You have the responsibility as Rent Guidelines Board to make the best decision possible. And I know I've been there. I know we have the opportunity to do a rent freeze. I encourage you to do that now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Assemblymember Epstein. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me next recognize Helen Greenberg.
Hi everyone. Hi, my name's Helen Greenberg and I'm a third generation small property owner. In 1954, my grandfather, David Greenberg, and his brother Sam purchased our family building after many decades of hard work. The hard work was painting apartments, collecting metal scraps, and finally running a hardware store. They were the lucky ones out of their family who fled Poland. My grandfather was born in 1896. In Poland, he was a victim of many forms of anti-Semitism in safety, worship, and home ownership. Our building that we have is in the East Village. My kids went to the neighborhood schools, East Village Community School, Tompkins Square, and Essex Street Academy, and ICE. I'm trying to understand how math became so political. Here are a few examples of math that I deal with. For now, property taxes increased by $9,029. I left out cents, so just rounded up. Insurance increased by $3,737. And the mortgage was raised an additional $2,737 a month. That's a lot for us. I disagree with the current socialist officials who want to just really destroy private property ownership. With no private ownership and no property taxes, that pretty much equals no funding for schools, local governments, or services. That's just the sentiment we feel as small property owners, and it's horrifying and scary and just disheartening. Okay, back to math. So we have many stabilized tenants that have been with us for decades, and it's reflected in their rents. So let's say $710, $569, $734. That doesn't cover anything, like nothing. And the 2019 rent guidelines continues to chokehold small property owners. Rent freezes and meager increases will do the same. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish there was housing for everyone. It's disheartening also hearing all these stories. I wish everyone well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Let me next recognize Junchi Lee.
我是讲了，我是唐人街的中科的协会会员，希望市场阁下关注我们的生活最底层的脆弱的群。我们是依靠退休金646美元的微薄的收入维持生活。我今年70岁了，身体的原因我。
We have a translator?
Yes.
Sorry, we couldn't hear you. You could repeat. Thank you.
Member of the Chinatown Tenants Union. I hope that
Sorry, if you could try one more time. We heard the beginning, but if you could.
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. I am a member of the Chinatown Tenants Union. They pay attention to the vulnerable groups at the bottom of the group. I currently rely on my retirement of $676 to live my life.
因为有身体的原因，我60岁就退休了。租金现在是1320万，物价暴涨，生活困难，唯一的办法就是分租一点，但是还不够还租，因为他们也是退休老人。
This year I'm 70 years.
Apologies. If you could, sorry, try one more time and move just a little bit closer to the center. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Much better.
Okay. This year, he's 70 years old, and because of health reasons, he had to retire at 62. Mr. Lee's current rent is $1,320, and it's only going up, along with the cost of living. Life is very difficult. The only way to live is to have roommates, but even this solution is not enough for the rent because his roommates are also retirees.
我现在收入90%都付给租金，还有煤气、电器等等费用。如果在加租不给我们减租，我们就要被他们驱赶。租了一个鸟那哈。
I currently pay 90% of my income to rent, and that's not counting gas, electric, and bills. If my rent were to go up, I would have a really hard time paying and be evicted, and there would be one.
很多，我要求市长和租金管理委员会会给我们减租。 那我们过得幸福的晚年。
There are many retirees in Chinatown in similar situations as me. I demand the mayor and the Rent Guidelines Board let us live a peaceful rest of our lives.
谢谢。
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for the delay.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me please recognize Jonathan Early.
Hi there, how are you? Good evening to everyone on the board and those watching at home. My name is Jonathan Early, and I first moved to my current residence 9 years ago as an incredibly poor paraprofessional in New York City schools. And have been happy to stay here as I grew into an older, less poor elementary school teacher teaching in the South Bronx. I owe this building a lot. I met my girlfriend, soon-to-be fiance here. I've made friends and recently been president of my building's tenant association. I've been blessed to stay and turn this apartment into a home solely based on the reasonable rent stabilization laws. Otherwise, I would have had to hop from building to building every year or two trying to find a place to stay afloat, a task that's harder and harder every day. Today, the Adams administration proposed a 3% raise for all teachers. Inflation last year was 7.5%, and proposed rent increases include potential raises of 5% and 7% respectively. It seems if this passes, I'll be going back to being once again to an incredibly poor teacher. The main problem I have with this proposal is that we're already paying for work that is not done. My current building has had multiple apartments that have already had their rent illegally raised, something we've only just realized digging through rent histories. My current apartment has had a rent jump of 160% just a few years before my girlfriend moved in, and soon they'll be allowed to increase it another 7% legally. You would think with the money we are paying, we wouldn't have to have fake cameras throughout the building. That's true. Broken security doors on the roof causing teenagers to play games where there's no protection. Also true. People able to break in and sleep in our basement, not to mention the multitude of apartments that have rats, leaks, roaches, and more. But that's reality. By the way, this building is not an anomaly. We are a norm for most rent-stabilized buildings. Right now, it's equivalent to going to Peter Luger's, ordering a full steak dinner and only receiving a baked potato month after month. If there were efforts to improve our building, this would not be a problem. But instead, we have to sue our management company that owns over 100 buildings. Just yesterday, I received a settlement check after 4 years of waiting and fighting, forcing me to put a lien on the building. Thank you very much, and please give teachers like me and other locals a chance to continue to live in our buildings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Peter Vecchiarellis. Mr. Vecchiarellis, if you're here, please unmute and join us.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Vecchiarellis, and I am a small property manager for a few buildings in New York City. As a property manager that doesn't own any rent-stabilized buildings, I feel I can be impartial to both the landlords and the tenants. I see the daily struggles of the tenants and the landlords. I see how hard it is for tenants to get the resources and help they need because housing court is not operating at 100%. It's very hard for tenants to get the help they need. I hear them week after week going to court, seeking help and getting turned away. As a result of not getting the rent paid, the landlords are having a hard time getting a mortgage or an equity line. We're turned down from the banks as the rental income can't support the mortgage at the current interest rates of about 6.5% to 7% on commercial loans. It's never been as hard to pay our bills. Property taxes are very high, fuel is very high, insurance premiums have gone up 10%, construction cost is 30% higher. Rent hasn't kept up with the cost, and in many cases, landlords are not getting rent for years. I have tenants that have not paid since February of 2019. The landlords, even though are not looking to evict them, they want to get their money paid. They're not looking to evict anybody. They just want to continue getting their rent. None of my landlords, tenants have had issues connecting with support programs. This must change. My landlords house many young families and seniors. We as landlords look out for both. Tenant activists decry when publicly traded real estate companies or corporate owners of private equity scoop up buildings in neighborhoods where we should have local ownership. But then when the same people are the ones supporting legislators who create policies that make it impossible for local owners to keep their buildings, there is an inconsistency. You can't have both. Landlords are providing affordable housing without a safety net. Government programs can help the tenants, but nothing for the landlords.
Thank you. Thank you for
you.
your testimony. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Let me next recognize Yun Chen.
Okay, sure. Sorry, we need a second to configure.
That's fine. Please take a moment.
站起来，站起来，面对 Sorry, lots of technical difficulties. And we will also be interpreting this one.
Hello， 大家好，我是陈宇。
Okay, it's not working.
台南市住客协会会员，以前是在餐馆做工，疫情以后没公开，现在退休了。
Hi, my name is Chen Yun. I'm a member of CAB Organizing Asian Communities in Chinatown. Before, I worked at a restaurant. Since the pandemic, there's been no work, and now I'm retired.
我在台南接触了26年，以前的租金是640，现在的租金是1158。
For 26 years, I've lived in Chinatown. In the past, my rent was $640 a month. Now rent is $1,158.
现在已经退休了，在家租怎么找这个钱来交租？租金已经涨到1300。
Now I've retired. If they hike up rents, how are we going to find the money to pay rent? If rent increases to $1,300, I don't have enough for rent.
就不够交房租，电费、电话费加起来都不够交房租，去哪里找这个钱？
Electricity bills, phone bills, added up, I don't have enough. Where am I going to find this money?
现在纽约的住客生活不易，环境卫生差，失业人士很多。
In New York, tenants live difficult lives. Our living conditions are unsafe. So many people have lost their livelihoods.
很多人跟我的条件是差不多，希望亚当斯最好为低收入人考虑减租金。
So many people share my experience. Mayor Adams, you need to account for working class people and roll back the rent.
加租也是分感的一种方法。住客在纽约生活这么久，看医生、买东西都方便，亲戚朋友都在纽约。
Rent hikes are also a form of eviction. We as tenants have lived in New York for so long. We see our doctors here. We buy our groceries here. Our relatives, our friends are all here.
希望全部住客共同努力，反对批改。
Tenants, we must fight. We must unite to fight evictions.
争取我们住客的权利。
We need to fight for our rights as tenants. Okay.
减租
Rent roll back now.
减租。谢谢大家。
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me next recognize Carolyn Meckler.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Go ahead.
Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I'm a small property owner on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I own and manage a 5-unit building with my husband. We live in the building and we don't take a salary for maintaining the building. I raised 2 children in the building who also help me take care of the building. So we run a lean and mean shop. In the 22 years I've managed this building, I have never evicted a single tenant. I know all my tenants and I work with them through their struggling times. I sympathize with the struggling tenants, but there are plenty of programs available for truly struggling tenants. No fixed income senior should be forced to leave their home because they no longer can afford their apartments. This is why we have SCREE programs, and I even had a SCREE tenant for 20 years. But there isn't an equivalent for landlords to SCREE. In the 22 years I've managed my building, in 2022, my building lost $40,000 on a cash flow basis, primarily driven by facade work that could no longer be deferred. Over the last 5 years, I've had to replace the sidewalk, exterior stairs, and the boiler. This is the constant struggle of maintaining a building that was built in 1885. It must be done. It can't be left. Property taxes represent 32% of 2022's revenue and roughly 38% of my operating costs. Over the past 10 years, my taxes have gone up 160% versus my revenue that's only gone up 137%. The gap between income and revenue isn't sustainable. Rent hikes is the only source of income, and it's vital to small property owners so that we can maintain our buildings and provide housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Councilmember Gail Brewer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am Gail Brewer. I represent the Upper West Side, and I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know that, and I just heard from the previous speaker for whom I work because I represent her area. I do own a building, so I do know how the expenses go up, but I want to be very clear. I support a rent freeze or rent reduction. We know about inflation. We know that it's hard to afford housing and to still have food and utilities for so many tenants. It's a choice, and I really support the tenants. The New York eviction moratorium expired last year. My understanding is that there are 260,000 eviction filings in court as of March 2023. And in the past, not really recently, but in the past, this board has voted for large rent hikes. They cannot do so this year. According to the Community Services Society, a higher proportion of tenants were threatened with eviction last year than in the past 11 years. And I'm sure it has something to do with the pandemic. And of course, we also have, challenging in our city, the wonderful asylum seekers, but it doesn't help with the rent situation. We know that the New York State Emergency Rental Assistance Program, known as ERAP, did help some New Yorkers meet their rent payments, and the pandemic has subsided since then, but the hardships are long lasting. And there are, at least 405,000 applications and $3 billion in assistance obligated or paid out to the owners on behalf of tenants. Again, that I know that it's never enough, but those are the facts. We got an increase in the cost of living. So I guess what I'm trying to say is my office is swamped with calls from people who cannot make the rent. We also have many seniors who understandably can get SCREE, or she, in this case SCREE, if they make $50,000 or less, but they are also swamped. So please do not increase the Rent Guidelines Board amount that tenants have to pay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me next recognize Jeannie Dobdown.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'd like to answer some of the small landlords' points that they made. One is to Ms. Greenberg, who spoke before. Does she know, or I think she does, that any owner who can establish that they're making less than 5% profit can get a rent increase if they open their books? But she doesn't do it. I've never heard of any small landlord who does it. And you on the RGB board all know this. You've known it for years. To Carolyn Meckler, who has go get a job. If you get a job, maybe you would work for a living and you'd get an income if you're so worried about the low rents. Now, we are in a public emergency. Homelessness in New York City has reached the highest levels since the Great Depression of the 1930s. There were nearly 70,000 homeless people in December of 22, including 22,000 children sleeping each night in the shelter system. Roughly 1/3 of families in shelters are still working, but are homeless. I'm not even talking about people on the street. So the rising rents, which we saw Mayor Adams had an increase last year of 5%, is causing poverty. But you guys on the Rent Guidelines Board, you all know this. You all know this. We're not telling you anything new, for Christ's sake. If you increase rents, you're going to cause more homelessness, okay? You're going to put more people into shelters. I'm a volunteer for RENA, community organization in Washington Heights. Our median household income is, and this is new, this is what it is now, $55,000 for a family of 4. How much can such a family afford? 1/3 of their income would be $1,529. Rent Guidelines Board, help me find a 2-bedroom apartment in Northern Manhattan for that amount.
Thank you.
Okay, can you do it? No, you can't. Housing is a human right, like food and healthcare. The rents are too damn high. RGB, roll back rents.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Jewel Hanlon, who I believe is joining us by phone. And if you're speaking, Ms. Hanlon, if you could please unmute.
You might have to press *6 to unmute yourself. *6 to unmute yourself.
Can the host also just unmute them?
I just tried to, I don't seem to have that capacity. I can ask to unmute, but I don't seem to be able to. There we go.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't know I had the power to change that. Can everyone hear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank RGB for this opportunity to speak. I feel that you have the power to teach neglectful or abusive landlords to obey laws by not allowing rent increases. My brother and I live on the Upper West Side. We share an apartment in a building where management of an SRO have been dispersing unlawful chemicals, not limited to pesticides, in our home and public access areas. They use unlicensed strangers, ex-convicts, and other tenants, despite inspections by air quality inspectors, 6 years of housing court in a lawsuit I didn't give up on, and 8 violations from city and state air quality agencies. They persist in doing this. They were found using, mostly for not residential use, 15 illegal chemicals. One in 2020 was so lethal it could cause death if inhaled. New York State DEC issued a violation with the warning they will face criminal prosecution in jail when caught again. In 2016, I started this HP case to get it stopped. And I learned that housing court judges' power is limited, so without enforcement, it really hasn't stopped. I've reported every year since 2013 with 311 complaints. Every effort I've ever made has led to no change. What's problematic right now is that I don't want the harassment and retaliation that has been happening just because I call 311 or filed, again in housing court. And because of that, I live with a death threat and other problems. Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. If
Oh.
you could please wrap up
I'm
your testimony.
almost done.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I was going to say that nothing's changed, and we just ask that you not grant SRO hotels rent increases given their abuse of tenants. There's no escape from the air we breathe. It's like breathing an invisible fire, which everyone can relate to right now because of what's going on in the city. And that is something that is not, to me, not an acceptable. I pay my rent. I haven't been late. I've been paying in advance, but not giving rent increases is one way the RGB can influence change. The EPA toxicologists warned that what we inhale, we cannot take back, and that as we age, disease comes. So please, I urge this board to not allow Dexter House to have rent increase or any SRO in this city where people are on very low income and, have affordable housing, rent stabilized, protected apartments. Please consider that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. Let me next recognize Jesse Sutton.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. My name is Jesse Sutton. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I say that because since 1969, rent stabilization laws have been in effect. That's what we mentioned before. And there's been a rent crisis since 1969. As we've been taking supply off of the market, the rents have been going up on every free market unit. I own one building in Brooklyn at 16 units stabilized. I've been losing money for the last 3 years. I appreciate Ms. Dube now giving us some advice on how to collect that 5%, how to collect the increase on buildings that don't make 5%. We're averaging 40 to 50% of collections a month. It's impossible to survive as a building owner. It's impossible to keep a building alive. So there's two aspects here. I've been coming out of pocket every single year since we bought this building, taking food off my table to support this property. If we don't get the necessary rent increases, tenants will be living in much more dire situations. It comes down to our ability to afford it. And if we can afford it, we will do it. And I think I could speak on behalf of all landlords here. If we can do it, if we can afford it, we will spend it. I think that's what it comes down to. But when it comes down to not getting rent increases over the last 10 years, it's been very challenging for us. We need help, and we're relying on the RGB to help us. I wish we can all work together and figure out a proper platform to solve the rent crisis in New York City. I don't think it's rent stabilization, but we do need an increase. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Jeremy Kaplan.
Yes, hi. I'm a rent stabilized tenant in Sunset Park for the last 12 years. And I just wanted to say that my building that I'm in is a prime example. We've been hearing a lot about small landlords, and I know that this board is saying that they're dealing with data. Small landlords do not own the majority of the rent regulated apartments. Just Fix It had it at least, only 9% were owned by one person. So a lot of these landlords who are speaking don't really speak for the majority of the landlords. Unfortunately, my building is a prime example of what we're seeing is corporate landlords benefiting from rent increases, pushing out tenants. And I think that it's unconscionable to put these sort of numbers and data, people's profits, over the fact that people need stable housing, and that's what rent stabilization is for. I think it's incredible to sort of hear that rent stabilized apartments, the whole point is stability for people who cannot afford market rents. And what we're seeing basically is that corporate landlords, like people who own my building, the majority of the buildings are owned by big corporate landlords that basically a 5% rent increase is nothing to them, but it is evictions to so many tenants. And we're talking already, you've heard 260,000 eviction cases. You cannot do this to people. And the question is, why would you side with that when you're supposed to be dealing with data? That's what we've been hearing from Eric Adams. I know who Eric Adams is, and I know that he deals and parties with landlords. That's his prerogative. I think you, as a Rent Guidelines Board, need to be dealing with data and information. What is the best way to keep people housed? It's to keep them in rent-stabilized apartments that are affordable for them. We know how expensive it is to force people out of their homes to try to find housing. And then also on top of it, how expensive the shelter systems are that it's evicted people are forced into. So right now, to me, it's unconscionable to have this sort of false equivalency. Small landlords are a very, very minor part of this equation, and their profits do not matter. It's really about corporate landlords, and you're just providing slush funds for them. Those are the corporate landlords that got plenty of money during ERAP. And
thank you for your testimony.
It's unconscionable to me to be sitting here talking about how we have to justify not keeping people in their homes in the middle of a pandemic when people have not got the relief that they needed, when people have not rebounded from the pandemic. So I think right now, the real question is, are you going to continue to keep greasing a system that works for landlords? Or are you
We have a
going to
number of
say
speakers
enough?
we'd love to hear from. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think rent rollback, rent rollback.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Robert Lee.
All right. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. To the last gentleman that just spoke, there's fewer smaller landlords because the bigger landlords are buying us up like hotcakes. We are not able to sustain through all this. And first, let me give a complaint to the panel. I don't know why the politicians get to speak first, but we all have to wait. They make their own schedules, but the tenants and landlords here have to take time out from their day for this meeting. Several of these politicians that spoke today rent. So that is called a conflict. That is a conflict of interest. We don't have these meetings for the price of eggs that have skyrocketed. The cost of eggs go up. The groceries have to raise it. That's the end of it. Our expenses go up 10 to 30% each year. On top of that, we have more regulation. We have lead abatement, among other things. That lead abatement in some of these buildings are a fortune. Heat in the 2021 to 2022 season increased about 35–40%. I just want to, Assemblymember Roosevelt speaks of large owners making all this money, but she doesn't speak about the small owners. Councilmember Brewer says that she sides with the increases that we've absorbed over the past few years. But what have any of these politicians done about capping our expenses? They just took the largest salary increases of any politicians in the country. I don't know. Tenants here should be calling their offices and ask why they accepted these increases. We are a private industry, and we should not have to subsidize because of policy failures. In this state, the tenants have the 2019 HSTPA. We have a 2 to 3 backlog in courts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Virginia Crawford.
Okay. Hi, how we doing? Oh, we better do it vertical. Okay, there we go. Hi there. My name is Virginia. Is that on? Okay. Hi there. My name is Virginia Crawford, and I just want to say that what I see happening in my building in the West Village is that dozens of rent stabilized tenants have been forced out as a result of conditions created by a predatory investor. The inhumane conditions, these inhumane conditions are intentionally created by the investors in order to ensure that tenants surrender their apartments or that we stop paying rent in land and housing court. This is an investor playbook that threatens our health, safety, financial security, and our ability to save for homes of our own. I am continually shocked at what we have tolerated in this city. None of this is simply the old landlord-tenant dispute. The city and state have been complicit in undermining rent stabilization when enforcement only results in fines that pale in comparison to the profits to be made. Tenants will never be safe. What we should be talking about are good cause eviction protections and massive buyout programs for tenants in highly stressed properties. Not a rent increase that will result in increasing the value of these properties at the cost of vulnerable tenants, not a rent increase for the investors who ignore the human suffering in their properties. According to the United Nations, the definition of forced evictions can be broadly defined as the permanent or temporary removal against their will of individuals, families, or communities from the homes or land which they occupy without the provision and access to appropriate forms of legal and other protections. This is not just a housing crisis. This is a humanitarian crisis. Harassment should be considered a violation of human rights and treated as such by law. Please consider a rent right freeze or rollback until the human rights of tenants have been secured in New York City. Thank you.
Thank you. We next recognize Xu Zhen Liu. Let me try that again. Let me recognize Xu Zhen Liu.
Hi, we are going to need interpretation for this as well.
Of course, we'll wait.
Go.
Hello， 大家好，我是住在纽约，我是刘素贞，我在唐人街住了25年了，也是那个住客协会的会员，也是20多年了，但是我要。
Hello, my name is Liu Shu Zhen. I have lived in Manhattan's Chinatown for 25 years, and I am a member of the Chinatown Tenants Union.
要求我们要减加租，因为我的工作我退休了，我70岁了，因为有生病，我的房租是1675，我的退休工资只有630。
My rent is $1,675. My retirement income is only $630.
因为我的房租不够，减加租也不够，他又不减。我们的州长那个亚当斯，他为了他自己是房东，他想收高租钱，他不减，我们就没办法。我要准备分租。
I can't afford my rent. It's more than my income. I think that the mayor, Mayor Adams, is increasing the rent because he is a landlord. I can't afford my rent, and I have to prepare to sublease.
因为我也不想流落街头，我也不想离开唐人街。 唐人街看医生是我们唐人的地方，买菜这么都好做。
I don't want to be homeless. I don't want to leave Chinatown. This is my neighborhood, my community's neighborhood. This is where I go to the doctors and do my groceries.
因为亚当斯没上台的时间，他说都是为我们穷人，为我们这些贫苦人。 上台了，他就变味， 他就不管我们这些，他只管他自己收房租。
Before Mayor Adams got elected, he said he would help poor people. He said he was for the working class people. But once he got elected, he turned sour. He doesn't care about us.
如果他再不减加租，再不理我们这些穷人，我们住客协会，我们的穷人就准备叫他滚蛋，不要他住。
He only cares about being a landlord and making his money. So us poor people, if he continues like this, we will kick him out of office.
他主要就是说，他要收房租，从来以前都没有加到这么高的房租。从亚当斯当了上任了，他不算数，就给我们加的一年比一年高。我们不知道我们穷人怎么做，我们也准备反对。
He keeps increasing the rent. Before Adams, the rent has never increased this much before. So us poor people, we don't know what else to do.
Thank you.
够时间，够时间了，好吧。那由于时间有限，我们现在就说到这里。有事。
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Ann Korchak.
Hi, good evening. The Korchak and Stegan family has been operating two 10-unit buildings on the Upper West Side for decades. The first building was purchased in 1941, and the second was purchased in the early 60s. I mention this to make the point that we are dedicated operators and committed to New York City. My mother-in-law and her brother attended Blessed Sacrament School there in the neighborhood, and my niece and nephew were also baptized at that parish. So we have deep roots in the Upper West Side. Members of the fourth generation of our family are now living in the building. We have tenants that knew their great-grandparents, but these children, of ours never knew them. Each year I come to speak at a hearing so that you will get to hear firsthand the challenges families like ours face as small building operators in New York City. Our largest expense by far is property tax. It's a hidden tax on every New York City renter, whether regulated or fair market. When the pandemic began, the tax bill for our 10-unit building was $77,000. This year, it's $93,000. That's a 20% increase. I need to collect $775 per month per apartment just to cover the property taxes. Several of our rent-regulated units have rent below that number. Add on utilities and insurance, and I need an additional $275 per month per apartment to cover those base operating expenses. Again, I have units with rents below that amount. Utilities is another expense that is largely beyond our control. Con Ed recently announced yet another rent increase. In February of 2020, it cost $1,800 to provide heat and hot water at a cost of about $1.50 per therm. This February, that monthly bill was $2,300 at nearly $2.66 per therm. I'm here as a reminder to you all that housing has costs and those rents must rise to cover those costs. This realistic position is not popular, but that doesn't change the truth that as operating expenses rise, so must rent. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Christopher Athenaeus.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify. I must say I was disappointed after testifying for decades in the past that I wasn't granted a safe space to testify as other property owners because of the events that happened at the initial meeting. And I hope that in the future, we can all have a safe space to debate respectfully with decorum so that we give the RGB and all the members of the RGB, tenant members, owner members, and public members, the respect that they deserve. My family and I have owned and operated apartment buildings in Brooklyn for over 50 years. My parents still live in and operate the building in which they live. And we're good owners. Our buildings are like a small community, little small city. We all look out for each other. the tenants are our friends. We look to provide good and safe, affordable housing. And this is not just this board's responsibility, but on all the prior boards before you, especially in the last 10 years, we've been neglecting and underfunding and defunding our housing. And we are at the breaking point. The board does not look at the PIOC, does not consider lead paint abatement. It's not in the PIOC. There's nothing in the PIOC that says about lead paint abatement, yet we have to abide by these mandates. It takes over a month or 2 months to get the apartment abated on vacancy, tested, retested, and re-rented. This is lost income for property owners. And if any of the tenants that have testified here actually came into these apartments, they would see there's nothing wrong. There's no reason that it had to be abated. Yet we have to comply with the law. And this costs money. And this board needs to recognize those mandates. Energy efficiencies, we're getting fined if we don't abide by the rent mandates, for energy efficiencies. So I would ask that the board recognize those costs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Brenda Irizarry.
Yes, good evening. My name is Brenda Irizarry, and I'm a member of Tenants and Neighbors and also a member of the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition. I have lived at 3215 Bainbridge Avenue for 41 years as a rent-stabilized tenant. My landlord is Brandon Yasger. I am urging the board to consider no rent increases and a rent rollback for the following reasons. Many tenants are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. Many tenants are facing evictions in court without right to counsel. There's food insecurity due to inflation and cuts to extra SNAP benefits. A healthcare crisis caused by medical debt and drug prices. Currently, I pay 30.8% of my monthly fixed income towards rent. I also pay more for my Con Ed bill because of inadequate heat during the winter. A rent increase based on paying more and getting less services is unacceptable. In closing, rent increases will cause more evictions, homelessness, and families doubling up in apartments. I urge this board to give tenants relief, not grief. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Anna Maria Parlanti.
Good evening to all. The small company I represent has owned and operated rent-stabilized apartment buildings for over 50 years. The past few years have been extremely difficult for the business, which is why we stand before you today asking for a fair annual increase. The recent passage of various local laws, such as 31 and 97, require landlords to spend hundreds and thousands of dollars on top of regular maintenance costs in order to make the necessary changes to remain code compliant. While we fully agree with the passage of the aforementioned laws, we also desperately need more funds to abide by them, funds which can only be obtained through the passage of a fair annual increase by the Rent Guidelines Board. Property owners are not only struggling to fund changes stipulated by new local laws, but are also having a hard time staying afloat in the face of rising everyday maintenance costs. The costs of everything that is required to maintain a building, including property taxes, water, insurance, labor, and materials, has skyrocketed in recent years, which has largely been caused by inflation. The rent law passed in 2019 caps individual apartment improvement costs at $15,000 for an $83.33 increase for landlords. It was difficult to renovate a vacant apartment to code with $15,000 then, but it is absolutely impossible to do so now, given the rise of material and labor costs. This is why warehousing apartments has unfortunately become a huge problem in our city. It's also imperative to note that the average age of the properties under our jurisdiction is 90 years old, and the amount of money needed to maintain them increases every year, even without growing inflation. This is why we ask the board to vote in favor of a 5% increase for one-year leases. In the absence of other forms of assistance for property owners, the only way to keep affordable housing safe is through passage of a fair annual increase. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Yang Ming Xu.
大家好，我是薛良敏，唐人街住客协会的会友。我今年70多岁了，在唐人街住了20多年。
My name is Xue Liangming, and I am a Chinatown tenant leader with CAB Organizing Asian Communities.
现在租金已经1000多，超过200%的退休金，我的房租还需要亲戚和朋友的帮助。
This year, I am over 70 years old. I've lived in Chinatown for over 20 years. Right now, my rent is more than $1,000, over 200% of my retirement savings each month. In order to afford rent, I need to rely on friends and relatives.
我不理解今年房租上涨这么高，为了负担每年租金上涨，对我们的日常生活造成了更加的困难。
I don't understand why the Rent Guidelines Board has been proposing such high rent increases. Just to afford each year's rent hikes, us tenants face tremendous difficulties in our everyday lives.
现在市场上物价这么高，又要涨这么高的租金，我们是低收入的人群，这样怎么生活？
Now we not only face skyrocketing cost of living increases, but we also face these rent hikes. We are poor and working class people. How are we supposed to live?
如果我们交了这么高的房租，就是走在被驱赶的边缘，这是我们不愿意、不希望的。
If we can't afford rent, then we're at risk of evictions. We don't want this. We refuse this. That's right.
请问市长先生跟租金评审委员会，你们考虑到房东受到疫情影响？
Mayor Adams, members of the Rent Guidelines Board, you only think of how the pandemic has impacted landlords.
提醒的是，租客们也是被疫情受害的人群。
Let me remind you, tenants too have been impacted by the pandemic.
请注意，现在物价不断上涨，我们的收入并没有提高。
Pay close attention. Right now, inflation is skyrocketing, yet our incomes remain fixed.
希望市长和租金评审委员会对我们低收入百姓做关心，有没有考虑到我们的生活艰难？
The mayor and the board need to account for working class people. Have they thought about what we must face, how difficult our lives are?
我们的生活品质在下滑，在贫困中增长，所以我们反对加租，强烈要求减租、减租再减租。
Our living conditions are deteriorating. We are struggling on the poverty line. We must demand roll back, roll back, roll back the rent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Marcelina Lake.
Thank you, sir. Let me start the video here. Yes. I'm so sorry. Yes, good evening all. My name is Marcelino Lake, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. My family has owned a property in Brooklyn since the 1960s, immigrated here from the Caribbean raised 4 children here and in Brooklyn, and had family members live in our buildings. It's a myriad. We've supported. We start rent control, rent stabilization, and what I want to speak on tonight is I manage my buildings very well. I maintain my buildings very well. I'm sorry for the myriad of landlords who have abused the system, take advantage of tenants, and don't provide the services that tenants deserve. I'm not one of them. I try and provide the best services for my tenants. I was raised that way. I worked in these buildings growing up. I have the sweat equity in these properties. It afforded us to go to college and stuff, and afford a nice lifestyle immigrating here from the islands. But to be honest, speaking for the tenants, there are a myriad of programs in the city. City Phelps, I'm advised through my building manager, through my brokers, a myriad of programs in the city that can help tenants in arrears, help tenants keep up with their rents, and actually help tenants with rent increases. These programs do not exist for property owners. And the expenses, it's expensive to own a building. That's just the bottom line. We signed up for that. I have no problem with that. But it's expensive to own a building. The fees, the utilities, expenses, the maintenance. So I have to advocate for a rent increase so I can provide quality services for my tenants and quality employment for my building staff. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We are going to now take a brief break, and we will return and continue with the testimony in 10 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you. Why don't we begin? Thank you. Let me recognize Kaylee Farish.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kaylee Farish. Give us just a second here. We're going to get the feedback off. Okay. Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Kaylee Farish. I am a tenant here, joining from a very packed tenant party here. I am a tenant in Manhattan, though I noticed a number of landlords from Brooklyn have already spoken. I'm not lucky enough to be in a rent stabilized building, but I am a renter. I've been a renter the entire time that I've lived in New York City. Last year, my rent went up 50%, 50. It went up again this year. My rent increase from 2021 to 2023, the increase alone is more than I have ever spent on rent in my entire life. We are in a specific housing crisis. And I have to tell you, it's something else to sit here in community and solidarity with people here who are living paycheck to paycheck and see landlords get on here who have inherited their buildings, living on intergenerational wealth with complaints about $10,000 increases in property taxes. We know from the assembly members submitted testimony that nearly 90% of rent stabilized units in New York City come from landlords that own over 100 units. And we have landlords here today who are saying that they are small property owners. And I can Google and see that you own 5 buildings in Brooklyn. You own 16 units. It's a level of wealth that is unimaginable to renters. So I'm sorry that some of you are feeling a little bit of a squeeze. We are trying to figure out how we are going to pay rent and stay in our homes. Housing is a human right. And the fixed incomes that many of us are living on right now are insufficient. And it's really difficult to get in here and see folks speaking about this like it's an abstract thing. Okay, property taxes are increasing. Great. We are not here to subsidize your investment decisions or the way you manage your intergenerational wealth. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Ricky Baker Cush.
My name is Ricky Baker Koish, and I'm a Queens tenant. Thank you for allowing us to testify virtually. My dad spent his childhood in Mitchell-Lama housing, and I grew up in a rent-stabilized apartment in Forest Hills where my parents and brother still live. After graduating with my master's degree, I couldn't afford a market rate apartment in the neighborhoods where I grew up, but was lucky enough to get into a rent-stabilized apartment elsewhere in Queens. I thought this would be simply my first New York apartment. It's a 1-bedroom without much natural light. All the windows face the building next door that's so close I can watch my neighbor's TV. There's no breeze or a laundry room, but it's a great community and a great first apartment in New York City. It's just not where I can raise the next generation of Queens kids. But looking at my neighbor's rent, I feel trapped. My partner and I already spend over 30% of our income on rent, like the 80% of New Yorkers who are housing burdened, but we can't afford to move. New rent stabilized units proposed in our neighborhood are more expensive and rare to get, even though we only moved into our apartment in 2019. Many market rate apartments are double what we pay, and the costs keep increasing. Like most rent stabilized tenants, our landlord is an LLC that owns dozens of buildings across the city. The corporations are doing fine. But even when I have been a city and state government employee working my hardest to make New York work for New Yorkers, I have struggled to make rent. My sister just moved out of our parents' apartment and pays more than I do for a small studio farther from public transit. My family's being priced out of Queens, of New York, and of our home. The rent has been too damn high in New York my entire life. My parents are unlikely to ever retire. I don't know how my brother will be able to move out of their place when he graduates Queens College in 2025. I'm nearly 30 and don't know if my partner and I will ever be able to afford a 2-bedroom, and don't know how we're supposed to even consider having kids. A report by the Fund for New York City found half of all city households do not make enough to meet the minimum cost of living. When the economic situation across our city, state, country, and globally is so dire for my generation and the generations to come, how can we pay rent and pay back our student loans? How can we afford healthy food and medical care for chronic illnesses we develop from novel viruses like COVID-19 or unsafe polluted air when we're spending 30 to 50% or more on rent? The Rent Guidelines Board's original charge is to ensure that rent remains affordable and not to protect landlords' profits. Please don't raise our rent when we can't afford it.
Thank you very much. Let me next recognize Adrian Gerstel.
Thank you very much. I always find these meetings extremely illuminating. I bought this building, my husband and I bought this building in 1980, so that's 43 years ago. It was a 6-unit rent stabilized apartment. We brought our children up in this building, and it was extremely important that we had and have a relationship with the people who live in this building. 2 of the tenants have lived here over 40 years, one of them about 39 years. During the time, one of the tenants, I want to give you another view of a landlord, okay? A small property owner. And so he was having financial difficulties for 3 years. I worked with him for 3 years so that he could pay what he could. There was a point where he said, I can either pay my health insurance, my credit cards, or my rent. And I said, there is no way you're going to mess around with your health insurance. I am lending you the money for your health insurance. That I did. A friend of his was rather upset about that and really started helping out pay the rent. This is somebody who's been here for more than 40 years. At this point, is financially solvent. I want to say that I am not retired because I own a building. My husband is not retired and he is going to be 80. There is a limit to how long we can sustain the amounts that we are. There's a lot to the story, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me next recognize Stephanie Pear.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie and I am born and raised in Brooklyn and I am a case manager. I have been working in nonprofit for about 7 years and the rent increases are just insane. If they are approved, my rent will go up almost $100 and I cannot afford that. That means that I might have to go into shelter with my clients. So I just don't understand, last year we had an increase. During the pandemic, you landlords, the managements were doing all these deals. So you were able to decrease the rent. So what's the difference now? Because everyone came back, all the gentrifiers, all the money came back, and now you see an opportunity. But for us New Yorkers, us people living, it's not sustainable. And I understand you have costs, but owning a building is a luxury. Get another job like you tell us. I work 2 jobs and I could still barely afford my rent. I have had mice in my apartment that I had to go fight to get repairs. I had to fight to get a rent reduction because of all the repairs that were not done, and then to sit there and say, we have to now increase your rent $100. And I know my rent is cheaper than a lot of people. So some people are going 200-300. And I just can't, I cannot sit here and listen to landlords complain that you have no money when for years before gentrification happened, everything was okay. So I get it, but unfortunately, the people are going to be homeless and you are always going to have tenants. You're always going to have people coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Gabriela Murillo.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Gabriela Murillo. Soy miembro de Make the Road New York. Vivo en Queens, en un apartamento de renta estabilizada. He vivido por 12 años con mis 4 hijos. Pago más del 30% de ingreso en renta. Y estos incrementos contemplados ayudaría a mi casero a desalojarnos, algo que ya he estado intentando hacer por medio de construcciones e intimidación. El edificio donde vivo tiene 44 violaciones abiertas. Me parece injusto que aunque mi alquiler sigue incrementando año tras año, aún así las condiciones no son buenas, no es justo. En la primavera del 2022, el nuevo dueño compró la propiedad. Después de esto, el casero se negaba a darme mi contrato de arrendamiento, aunque es mi derecho. Al poco tiempo, el señor Mola, dueño de la propiedad, empezó a demoler los departamentos vacíos del edificio sin aviso previo a los inquilinos que estamos viviendo en esta propiedad. Fue una situación muy dañina para la salud de mi familia, pues mis hijos tienen asma y el lugar estaba lleno de polvo en medio de construcción. Cuando le pedí al casero que por favor hiciera algo para controlar las áreas de construcción, este se negó y siguió como si nada. Así que tuve que poner una queja y resulta que ni siquiera tenía los permisos para hacer las construcciones. Como me he defendido, el casero me sigue acosando y tratando de empujarme para que yo me vaya. No limpia el edificio, el edificio tiene ratas, cucarachas y así nos quieren subir la renta. Es injusto. Las rentas ya son demasiado altas y si hay caseros que siguen comprando edificios es porque las rentas actuales ya les dan una ganancia sustantiva. ¿De dónde vamos a sacar más dinero cada año para mantenernos a flote? Les pido a ustedes, como miembros de la Junta, que apoyen a los inquilinos y nos sigan ayudando a destruir comunidades. No podemos seguir sosteniendo estos incrementos tan grandes. ¿A dónde vamos a ir mi familia y las otras familias neoyorquinas? No podemos pagar por estos incrementos propuestos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. If you could please hold on for a moment. We are trying to identify an interpreter.
I can interpret for her.
I would greatly appreciate that. We had a little bit of a glitch with the simultaneous translation. I greatly appreciate it.
Yes, please, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Gabriela Murillo, and I am a member of Make the Road New York. I live in Queens, and as a rent stabilized apartment. I have lived there for 12 years with my 4 children. I pay more than 30% of my income in rent, and these contemplated increases will help my landlord evict us. Something that he has already been trying to do through constructions and intimidation. The building where I live has 44 open violations. It seems unfair to me that although my rent continues to increase year after year, the conditions are still not as good, and it is unfair. In the spring of 2022, a new owner bought the property. After this, the landlord refused to give me my lease, even though it is my right. Soon after, Mr. Mola, the owner of the property, began demolishing the empty apartments in the building without prior notice to the tenants who were living there. It was a very harmful situation for my family because my children have asthma and the place was full of dust and in the middle of construction. When I asked the landlord to please do something to control the construction areas, he refused, and then as if nothing had happened. So I had to file a complaint, and it turned out that he did not even have the permits to do the construction. As I have defended myself, the landlord continues to harass me to leave. They don't clean the building, we have rats and cockroaches, and they still want to raise our rent. It's unfair. The rents are already excessively high. And if there are landlords who continue to buy buildings, it is because the current rents already give them a substantial profit. Where are we going to get more money every year to stay afloat? I ask you, as board members who support tenants, to stop helping destroy communities. We can't keep sustaining these huge increases. Where's my family and I going to go, and thousands of families who can't afford these proposed increases? No more increments, please. Enough of all this abuse. And as my little sister said, please, we want to, let's not lose our home. Please, we don't want to become another member, another number in the statistics for homelessness in New York City. Thank you for all the attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're going to pause for a moment. We're just, we want to make sure we have the Spanish to English translation. Andrew, if you could let me know when we're ready to continue.
Okay, I've been speaking to the interpreters. They apologize. It was an issue. I think everything should be working now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Let me then recognize Delcinia Glover. And Ms. Glover, if you could please unmute.
Oh, so
Thank
sorry.
you.
Oh, so
Thank
sorry.
you.
I'm Delcinia Glover. I live at the Lenox Terrace Complex in Harlem, and I am a member and leader of the Tenants Association at Lenox Terrace. First, we are deeply disappointed that this Rent Guidelines Board did not see fit this year to hold an in-person meeting or tenant testimony in Manhattan when previous to the pandemic, there were two, one downtown and one in central Harlem, where our tenants could come and look the board in the eye. There are 6 buildings at Lenox Terrace and were erected in the 50s and 60s. It has 722 units in the complex, housing more than 3,000 people. The owners of Lenox Terrace and rent-regulated landlords across the city do not deserve a rent increase because most make a great deal of profit and they do so with nominal maintenance to rent-stabilized apartments. The Tenant Association here receives complaints constantly about the amount of time it takes to receive the most basic repairs. Longtime rent-stabilized tenants are living in apartments that have the same white painted metal kitchen cabinets on the walls, same medicine cabinets and fixtures in bathrooms, and flooring from when the buildings were first built more than 60 years ago. It can take 2 years or more to get a refrigerator or stove replacement. There's a significant senior population in Lenox Terrace, so much so that it should be a NORC. Many of most, if not most, seniors are living on fixed incomes, but may not be eligible for SCREE because their income may be slightly more than $50,000. The kinds of increases that you are proposing this year, or any increase after last year's increases, maybe what will finally put them out on the street and escalate the already existing and devastating homeless crisis. Landlords are not suffering, we tenants are. We tenants ask for a rent freeze. We believe that that is the only just and equitable thing to do. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Angel Bowers, who is joining us by phone. And if you're speaking, if you could please unmute. Thank you.
Hello.
There we go. We can hear you now.
I'm sorry. I need 1 second because I'm started cooking, but I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Angel Bowers, and I'm a tenant at Clarendon Gardens. There should not be an increase in rent because my children and I have been sick from long-term mold exposure, something that should never have happened. Instead of addressing the issues of leaks and floods from above me leading to mold growth growing inside the walls, ceilings of my apartment, they chose to ignore it. Instead, we were left to breathe in mold spores and mycotoxins that are detrimental to our health. They refused to remove the damaged walls and ceilings. It took me 3.5 years to finally get the work done by taking them to court and finding an environmentalist to inspect my home. We had to live under hazardous conditions and still are to this day. I have mold growth that keeps coming back inside my toilet tank as well as sewage odors, and Clarendon Gardens refused to address this issue. I also have mold underneath my kitchen sink, and they refuse to address it. All they continue to do is cover up the problem and say HPD goes by what they see, not what they smell. We lived without heat for 3 years with a D placed on the front door of our building, and they supposedly put in a new boiler and received an MCI increase in rent for that improvement. And the front door lock is always broken. Not to mention, my Con Edison bill almost doubled each year because we have to use heaters. I have not been able to pay my rent due to medical bills, expenses, and losses for me and my children due to becoming sick from mold. And my income is Social Security disability. Instead of taking me to court, they continue to harass me for the rent, knowing that because of their negligence, my children and I are sick and we are in a bad situation that they put us in. Instead of raising the rent, laws should be changed concerning the air we breathe inside our home, leaks, floods, and mold to ensure the safety and well-being of our families. A much more diligent inspection by HPD is needed, as well as mental health and hygiene. I should not have to go back and forth calling HPD. I don't smoke, drink, or do recreational drugs, and now I have asthma along with other health issues as well as my children because of long-term mold exposure. Rent is becoming increasingly high and unaffordable. So when you have issues such as this and more that are being ignored but still want to raise the rent, this is very unfair to tenants that have the right to live in livable, safe, and affordable apartments. Please freeze the rent, no increase. Thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. At this juncture, we have heard from everyone who pre-registered. If there are participants who would like to speak in the remainder of the time we have available, if you could please raise your hand and we can elevate you to a participant. Thank you.
Give us a second.
Of course.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Simone Walker, and I'm the Tenant Association President of Terrific Tenements located right here in Manhattan, 425 West 48th Street, 527 West 47th Street. And I'm here today on behalf of our 88 tenants in our building complex. We want you to know that there is power in agreement. We agree that tenants are overlooked, overcharged, and overwhelmed. The tenants are being overlooked. Many of the repairs, extermination, and sanitation, and preservation of the buildings, they're not being kept, but yet we are expected to pay more rent, more money for services that we don't get, especially our differently abled tenants who need special accommodations, but yet they are also discriminated against. The tenants are being overcharged for rents they do not owe. All these documents and all these falsification of records, and without submitting any proof to the tenants of what they owe, they are expected to pay money that they never signed up for. But yet we are expected to pay rent increases when we need a rent rollback. Tenants are also being overwhelmed by conditions, rules, and regulations that are not included in their lease. Yet illegal lockouts, illegal evictions are taking place right under our noses. But we need rent rollbacks. This is the reality. This is what we need. And we're not against you, we're just against the policy and the proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Jerry Matechka.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Jerry, and I'm a small owner of a 6-family rent-stabilized building in Queens. About 8 years ago, I purchased my first and only 6-family house that was in the prior owner's family since it was built in the late 20s. For some reason, they did never raise any of the rents in the prior 25 years, and in return did no improvements. Now that the individual apartment improvements have been greatly diminished by DHCR, I'm making all needed repairs with my own money, and rents are astoundingly low. The rents I'm providing are totally affordable. As a matter of fact, all apartments are stabilized, and 5 of the 6 tenants are paying me $1,300 or less each month for their 2-bedroom apartments. The rents I'm receiving are far less than a 2-bedroom in public housing. Meanwhile, my costs have been spiking incredibly. Examples, insurance. My current provider is giving me a renewal increase of 22% right now. When I tried to shop for another insurance provider, I was given 2 quotes that were double. Property taxes, okay, they've gone up over 7%. Con Ed bills, 15%. And fix-up costs are averaging about 15% a year. I'm providing local ownership and getting calls constantly from big real estate guys who want to buy my property. And I honestly don't know how much longer I can hold out. I have a good relationship with my tenants, but what do you think the big guys will do? They'll get rid of these tenants, and some of which have lived there their entire lives. The last few years, the measly and non-existent increases are catching up to me, and I need your rent increases to be at the top end of the proposed rent range. All my tenants renew this year for the first time in 2 years. So if you don't give me at least last year's RGB guidelines, it will be a disaster. Also, you cannot allow 0 or rollbacks. Please do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Let me next recognize Denisa Rodriguez.
Hello, my name is Denisa Rodriguez, and I live in Queens. I've lived here for approximately 30 years, and I paid more than 50% my fixed income rent. I have established law enforcement in my neighborhood. Based on the preliminary vote, my rent will go up for 1 year from $30 to $75, or for 2 years, $60 to $105. ERAP paid $1.8 billion to New York City landlords and is expected to pay a total of $2.3 billion. My landlord received $9,000 from my application. Therefore, there's no need to give landlords a rent increase at the sacrifice of rent-stabilized tenants.
My apologies. If you could speak closer to the microphone so we could hear you, I apologize.
If I can't afford my rent in the future, I will become homeless and die. Do you hear me, Rent Guidelines Board? Homelessness equals death. Landlords claim they need higher rents, but they do not use these monies to maintain their buildings. Despite years of rent increases, my landlord has not done any repairs and always uses the excuse that tenants don't give him access. That is a bold-faced lie. My building converted to condos in 2008, and my apartment has more than 70 open violations. The entire building, which is a condominium, has 201 HPD violations. My landlord owes the New York City a grand total of $21,716 for repairs that he refused to make. That's just in my one building. He owns multiple buildings with a large real estate corporation, and he's not the only landlord who takes advantage of HPD. The kicker is that my landlord is a multi-millionaire, and in the height of the pandemic, purchased a building in Manhattan for $8.5 million. So Rent Guidelines Board, please tell me, why my landlord needs a rent increase. I say no, absolutely not. We need a rent rollback. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me next recognize Chaplain Reddy.
Okay, good evening. I am Chaplain Reddy, and I am here with Housing Conservatory Coordinators. I just want to say something. I'm going to probably date myself, but there was a show on television, it may still be on, called Candy Camera. And they would do little pranks and make jokes. What we're having happening right now is not funny. This is not a joke. These are people's lives that is going on to all kinds of situations and chaos because of mismanagement in the city. I don't think landlords are bad. I don't think the rent guideline boards are evil. I just think we have mismanagement in the city that people are putting their own self-interest ahead of the well-being of other people. And that is inhumane. You cannot have people bleeding and trying to stick a Band-Aid on them when they are bleeding and hemorrhaging to death. So I want to say this. You have the power, you have the decisions. I think you are smart people. And I believe you want to do the right thing for people, but you are being pressured and put in the middle of this mess. So I'm going to help you and try to see about giving you a solution. That if you want to help the people, help the tenants, help the landlords, that they do not have to lose money and that the tenants do not have to be overcharged and put out and evicted. This city is well known for having some of the doggone poorest of all poorest of every day, every decade, every century, every night coming into the city. Take that tourist money and put it to good use and help the people who are tenants or who are landlords. You do not have to raise this rent. There is a lottery that has been going on for years. Take that lottery money and put that lottery money to good use for rent. They have parades going on here. They have all kinds of sports activities going on here. Tell the Yankees and the Knicks and the Mets to put a game together and raise some money to keep people from being put out of their home. That's all I have to say. Do the right thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me recognize Spencer Garcia.
Hi, my name is Spencer Garcia. I'm a lifelong New Yorker and I live in a rent stabilized apartment in Queens. I'm asking the Rent Guidelines Board to vote for a rent freeze or a rent rollback. I'm asking for a rent freeze or rollback because any rent increase will force tens of thousands of New Yorkers out of their homes and force hundreds of thousands more to forego paying for food, medical care, and other necessities in order to pay for their rent. Over half of rent stabilized tenants pay them more than 30% of their income in rent. This leads to nearly 25% of rent regulated tenants skipping medical care and meals, according to a recent 2022 survey. Any rent increases will directly lead to evictions, homelessness, and death. People will die if they can no longer afford the food, medication, or healthcare they need to survive, or if they freeze or sweat to death from living on the streets. This death is completely avoidable. Over half of New Yorkers are rent burdened, and amidst the ongoing pandemic and ever-increasing inflation, the number of rent-burdened New Yorkers continues to increase. Personally, my rent is over 40% of my monthly income. I spent over 2.5 months looking for my current apartment because I could only afford to pay so much on rent without getting into a situation where I would become financially unstable or housing insecure. If I was not living in a rent-stabilized apartment, I would not have been able to afford a studio in most areas of Queens or New York City as a whole, and especially in where the rental market is now, I cannot afford to move out of this apartment, but I may be forced to, and I don't know what to do. We have gotten to a point where people from New York can barely afford to stay here, and freezing rent will help keep New Yorkers in their homes. Lastly, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of New York City households are still dealing with the ramifications of the ongoing pandemic. People have experienced unemployment, loss of income, permanent disability, and inability to work due to long COVID, and many more extremely difficult financial situations. With no end in sight of the pandemic, New Yorkers will continue to struggle to pay rent and afford their basic needs. We've already seen the negative impact of last year's rent increases 15% of all tenants had been threatened with eviction in 2022, a record high in the past 11 years. Following the end of the eviction moratorium, non-payment eviction cases rose 167% in 2022, and the homeless shelter population rose by 8%, the first increase after 4 years of decline. Please freeze the rent, do a rent rollback, please. I am begging you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me recognize now Fred Newton.
One thing I cannot help wondering is the President of the United States, when he wants to appoint people, that has to be ratified by the Senate. I believe that the Rent Guidelines Board and many other city jobs and appointments, the mayor can pick them, so they can be confirmed by the city council. Because if the mayor appoints you, you're beholden to them, but if they have to be confirmed by the city council, you're much less likely to have what's known as rubber stamps. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, we don't have anyone else who's raised their hand, but we're happy to wait. The meeting has been noticed to go through 8, so if anybody else would like to join us, we certainly have a few more minutes. Genesis, please.
Yeah, today I'm joining the hearing. I'm joining the hearing from Midtown in Manhattan, and most of the people here are senior citizens. If you can see, a lot of them testify. About 50% of the people who testified today are from Manhattan. And the reason they came in person is because they don't have access to internet. A lot of them don't have access to their phones, and simply because they're poor, right? And it is super important for us as the Rent Guideline Board to make sure that Manhattan tenants have access to a hearing. If you, like you heard, we used to have 2 hearings, one in downtown, one in Harlem. And I think we need to commit to doing that. Again, tenants here are excited to be here, and they only came here because they really depend on the decisions that we're going to be making to next weekend. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you, Genesis. Let me recognize Ari Santiago. Please go ahead.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask a question for everyone in attendance. A lot of the conversation has been around tenants versus landlord, and I'm just curious, in all of the conversations I've seen in the Bronx and here now in Brooklyn, why are corporate landlords not really in attendance? And then my second question is, this is a blanket policy for all landlords. Just curious, there are small property owners that are suffering, but corporate landlords should not be profiting off of any rent increases. I don't understand why we're having sort of a blanket policy. Why are we not considering a tiered system? This just seems unreasonable given the economic differences in both of these groups. Small property owners do not make anywhere near the amount of profit as corporate landlords. If this could be a consideration for this board and for the chair, Nestor Davidson, that would be awesome.
Thank you.
Hi, just FYI, we only allow people to speak once per public hearing. We are having another public hearing in Thursday in Brooklyn, and anybody who wishes to speak again can come in person to that hearing. If there's anybody else in our last 4 minutes that wants to speak, please raise your hand, who hasn't spoken already.
We recognize Pilar de Jesus.
Hi, good evening. My name is Pilar de Jesus, and I am a tenant advocate at Take Root Justice, but I am a Latina born and raised in El Barrio. I'm a very passionate human being who truly believes that, and forgive me with the noise, I am in commute to my house. I just wanted to say and to really just uplift all the tenants who are out here talking about why a rent rollback and a rent freeze is a must. As it was mentioned, we have over 26,000 homeless kids in the shelter. That's not including the kids that are about to be born into homelessness or that are currently living in the streets. What are we doing about the future? The youth, I think, there's many songs, the children are the future, and we're not protecting that. We are protecting people who are using capitalism to make a living off of the inhumane thing that happened, the inhumaneness of being homeless, the inhumaneness of not having enough money to pay for food. Wow, these landlords are here like, oh my God, I'm so broke. Again, I think it was mentioned, that's a very small number of small landlords, and you do actually have resources to get help. There's more help for you than they are for the tenants, and I know this because I've been working very closely with tenants for 10 years, and for 10 years, I've only seen people like the Cromans of the world commit criminal violent crimes to tenants. I've only seen the landlord like the one where the tenants died at 333 East 181st Street because of the lack of resources that Rick Grouper was providing to his tenants. And that man had at the time 150 buildings. So he wasn't broke. I also, one of your reps is a lawyer. How much do the landlords pay for him? My last note, and I'll end here because I've said it numerous times, and I don't know why you guys don't look at that. Have the landlords open their books. Let's see how they're spending their money, because maybe instead of accusing us for not paying our rent, and because I hear a lot of it, oh, they're being irresponsible. Maybe they're being irresponsible with how they manage and they use their money, maybe spending too much money on lawyers for frivolous cases or to buy more buildings to keep tenants, especially marginalized tenants, in the violent harm and violating the housing law And also, because y'all taking a lot of subsidies and committing fraud, in my opinion. And then let's not talk about all the money they're taking in cannabis by violating the law there. So I just want to say they're not broke. And if they are, they should show you how broke they are. We all asked Trump to open his books. So why can't the landlords open their books?
Thank you. Let me next recognize Sylvia.
Hola, mi nombre es.
And if you could, before we get on, I want to make sure that we have
Hello?
translation available.
Yes.
Hello?
Interpret in English.
Okay, great. We also have it on, but thank you.
Wait, sorry, give me a second. Are you gonna say it all in Spanish or? Oh, okay. Does
Okay, great.
anybody
Thank
have-
you.
Do you guys have interpretation? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Hola, mi nombre
Hello.
es Silvia Sánchez.
My name
Buenas
is.
noches.
Good
Todos
afternoon.
hemos sufrido, sido impactados de una manera o de otra de esta
I've tried in one way or another
inflación y economía después del
to help my
COVID-19,
community.
que nos ha causado muchos el desempleo y falta de trabajo e ingresos.
I've been
Ansiedad,
suffering.
desespero, incertidumbre y depresión de índole mental y emocional,
I've been
causando
living in
grandes
uncertainty.
estragos, teniendo que escoger entre gastos primordiales como
We've
pago de
had to
renta,
choose whether
compra
to
de
buy
combustibles, medicamentos o
food or
necesidades
pay our
esenciales.
rent or our needs or our medications.
Yo misma personalmente fui una
I
víctima de
myself
desarrollo,
personally have been
cobrándome de
affected by this.
$24,000 de renta a
I've been being
$40,000
charged
de
to rent.
repetidamente. Siempre me mantuve confiada en el Dios que creo,
I've always trusted in the God that I believe in,
sin dudar de que lo imposible para Él es posible.
knowing that what is impossible for us is possible.
No miento al confesar que sentí desespero al no tener cómo pagar esa cantidad tan enorme. Llegar a ser desalojada junto a mi familia compuesta de 6 integrantes. Pero Dios nunca me ha abandonado y a pesar de la prueba que enfrenté, permaneció mi fe en Él. Muchos inquilinos estamos atravesando por esta misma situación, perturbando la paz y la tranquilidad al no saber con esta incertidumbre a qué nos vamos a enfrentar. Estos incrementos es el más grande del año 2013, o sea, hace 10 años. La ciudad de Nueva York es ya la más cara para rentar en todo el país. Hay que ganar más de $130,000 al año y es la realidad que se vive y la mayoría de nosotros no llega ni a la mitad de ese ingreso. A veces, a estos grandes caseros que les gusta encontrarse y son avariciosos, quiero decirles que con una buena administración del dinero y presupuesto no se hace un hoyo grande como quieren aparentar y dejar bien. Y pueden cubrir para trabajar con los gastos operativos necesarios sin tener que subir a tal nivel de esos % de renta para 1 año y 2 años, que son prácticamente el doble y hasta más del triple en la historia. Necesitamos estabilidad de viviendas asequibles por la protección para los inquilinos. El bienestar o beneficio de los caseros es de índole capitalista y avarista, con conflicto de interés y actuando con egoísmo. No es honesto, no es sensible, no es grato, no es humilde, no es prudente, no hay respeto. La responsabilidad es muy grande, pero no se está ejecutando debida y correctamente. Qué desilusión para nosotros la sociedad de clase baja. Una sociedad democrática de tipo representativa, como la igualdad, justicia y solidaridad, se está llevando de una manera muy negativa, malvada y dañina, ya que notablemente y claramente es hacia la clase alta, rica y avariciosa. La igualdad o el respeto a los derechos humanos fundamentales y valores es violado y no pueden ser desconocidos y es bien notable y visible a nuestros ojos.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight.
Le quiero dar las gracias a todos por compartir con nosotros.
And can I get a motion to adjourn?
Y si alguien
Motion to adjourn.
And a second. Thank you again, and thank you to all of our board members and to our staff. And we will see you in Brooklyn on